Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time to join us for this session today. My name is Kayla Burkholder and I will be the host for this webinar. We have a really great session planned for you today. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Brinker, we're a software product company with a focus on enterprise cyber risk management. Today we're going to be talking about modern vulnerability management, knowledge, automation, and analytics. With a growing number of new vulnerabilities disclosed every year, increasing attacker sophistication, and a myriad of tools and teams that have to be synchronized in order to be effective in responding to these, most organizations end up struggling with designing and implementing a truly effective vulnerability management program. So in this webinar today, we're going to discuss three important key components to any modern vulnerability management program. They must address knowledge, so that's how to create actionable intelligence from business context, threat intelligence, and really any other relevant data source. The automation, so how do you implement automation and streamline significant parts of the VM process? And then lastly, analytics. How do we effectively engage and inform all of our stakeholders? So at the end, we're actually going to have a Q&A section, so please feel free to send us any of your questions throughout the webinar using the client, and we'll try to get as many of those answered today. And what I'm going to do next is introduce our panel of speakers and our moderator. Syed Abdur is our Director of Product, so he's responsible for driving the overall strategy and technical direction of Brinker product lines. Holger Schulze is the founder and CEO of Cybersecurity Insiders. This is a rapidly growing community online. It's a content platform that aims to inform, educate, and connect over 400,000 InfoSec professionals and thousands of cyber vendors. And then lastly, we have James Walta, who is our lead sales engineer for Brinker in the US and Europe regions. I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Syed to kick off with the agenda, and we'll get underway.
Thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to spend with us, and we hope that this is going to be an informative and good session for you. So just really quickly about Brinker. So we are a cyber risk management firm based out of Austin, Texas. Our focus is very much on helping organizations do a better job of evaluating and addressing their cyber risk problems across their enterprise and in different parts of their technology infrastructure. The key thing with how we address these problems is that we take a very knowledge-first approach to solving these problems, and our platform and our technology has really been developed to bring in information from a lot of different sources and put it together to really create new knowledge that can be applied to these problems. And the way that our customers use Brinker is really to understand and get a better grip on the true security risks that their organizations are faced with, and then do a better job of essentially prioritizing what they need to address, where they need to focus their attention, where they need to spend more money, what are their critical risks that they need to focus on and that they need to address, and then also track various metrics and KRIs and KPIs throughout the process, so very much focused on analytics, presenting information to all the different stakeholders, and providing real-time answers to problems. So again, that is a big part of what we do, is that we present live information by collecting it very quickly, very rapidly, and processing it at a very high speed to present near real-time results for problems to our customers. Today we are really going to be talking about vulnerability management. So we're going to start off talking about why vulnerability management is a critical problem that almost all organizations must address today. We're going to look at some of the challenges that organizations face that keeps them from addressing this problem in an effective manner. We're going to look at what a typical process for vulnerability management lifecycle looks like, and then we're going to talk about knowledge graphs and how that really cool concept applies to the problem of vulnerability management and how it can really help us address this problem in a better manner. And then we're going to focus on three critical capabilities of any vulnerability management program that all organizations must at least attempt to get a handle on. We're going to talk about knowledge, automation, and analytics, and obviously we're going to get into this in a lot of detail later on. And then towards the end, we also have a short demo of our platform, which is what James is going to run us through. And then we have a Q&A session at the end that Kayla mentioned. So please send us your questions through the interface, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as possible. And with that, I would like to welcome Holger Schulze. So we're really excited to have Holger on with us for this session. Like Kayla mentioned, Holger is the CEO and founder of Cybersecurity Insiders. Among other things, they manage one of the largest communities of cybersecurity professionals on LinkedIn and in other social spaces. So we're really excited to have him here and get his perspective on this problem and get our message across to his community and his audience. So welcome, Holger.
Thank you, Sayed, and thanks for having me. Vulnerability management is, as you can imagine, it's one of the hardest and most discussed topics, right, in our cybersecurity community. And I think that's not surprising, right? If you look at the environment cybersecurity professionals find themselves in, this environment is becoming increasingly challenging, right, for today's organization. Number of vulnerabilities is growing significantly, right? Hackers, attackers are becoming more sophisticated. IT environments, right, they're becoming more complex, dynamic, distributed workloads, right? The perimeter is dissolving. So a lot of organizations struggle with vulnerability management. But let me ask you, Sayed, why should effective vulnerability management, why should it be a priority for InfoSec organizations in your mind?
Sure, yeah, so I think you did a pretty good recap of sort of the same problems that we hear from a lot of our customers. But to sort of drill down into that a little bit more, one of the reasons that we really see this becoming a concern and becoming a priority for organizations is just that it is a consequence of what we are seeing, how attackers are essentially attacking our enterprises. So if you sort of look at the statistic from the latest Verizon DPIR report, which talks about the top assets that are involved in breaches, we can see all kinds of servers, whether it's database servers or point-of-sale systems or actual desktop devices or any other type of network-connected object or web applications. These tend to be a primary point of attack for hackers, and it kind of makes sense because this is what defines our infrastructure, and the vulnerabilities really are a representation of the known problems that exist in our infrastructure. So the very obvious chinks in our armor, if you would, right? So it becomes important for us to address these problems, and the reason why it becomes really difficult is because we're seeing very large volumes of vulnerabilities being disclosed. So I think now is a really good time to talk about this because 2017 was an absolute bumper crop for vulnerabilities. So more than 20,000 new vulnerabilities were disclosed in 2017, and comparing that to the number from the previous year, which was around 6,500 in 2016, so almost more than a 200% increase in just the volume of vulnerabilities being disclosed. And some of this obviously is a consequence of the new infrastructures that we're employing, but just dealing with these huge volumes of vulnerabilities that are coming in and that don't show any signs of decreasing, it makes our problems more difficult because now we're dealing with more data, we're dealing with more vulnerabilities that we need to process and analyze and essentially prioritize and determine what we want to do with them. And in addition to the new vulnerabilities, the old vulnerabilities continue to be a problem. So if any of us that have significant organization infrastructure sizes, if we go and look at the oldest vulnerabilities that exist in our systems, you would be surprised how old they are. And these are just the disclosed vulnerabilities, right? So we're talking about vulnerabilities that have been disclosed 10 years ago and they still exist in our systems because, maybe we took a determination at that point that they're not super important for us to fix. But the reason why this becomes really tricky is on the attacker side, things are constantly evolving. So what if a vulnerability that was not a big problem 10 years ago suddenly becomes a problem because someone figures out how to weaponize it? So those kinds of problems really exacerbate an already tricky challenge. And the other sort of side of this old vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that maybe were not disclosed a long time ago, but that have existed in our infrastructures forever. And a really good example of this is shell shock. It was, all over the news in 2014 and 2015, and it continues to be a problem in some form or other. But this is a problem that existed in the bash shell code, and it existed for 25 years before anybody figured out that it was there and it was a problem. So again, you know, the fact that we have these massive technology infrastructures where we don't necessarily have really good visibility and where we have a large volume of vulnerabilities existing, it really creates a problem for us. And then to further kind of complicate the problem, we are seeing our technology infrastructures change as well, right? So we are talking about new technologies that are coming in and being a part of our infrastructure. We're talking about SaaS, we're talking about cloud, we're talking about services as delivered through the cloud mechanism. We're talking about containers, we're talking about IoT, we're talking about mobile devices, all these things that are now becoming a part of our infrastructure, and really we're struggling with how we should analyze and process all of this information. So yeah, those I think are some of the main needs that we're hearing from people, which is why this is becoming such an important problem to fix. So
interesting point. A quick question that I have. So you said, you know, more data, right, at risk, more attack vectors, right, more complex technology, and I imagine that's hard to solve, right, with sort of traditional piecemeal approach and silo solutions. Let me ask you this: what is a complete, you know, end-to-end vulnerability management process? Well, what should that look like?
Sure, yeah. So once we kind of, you know, struggle with the problem of all these vulnerabilities coming in, the fact that we're seeing so many new vulnerabilities that are coming in from all over the place, the fact that the attack landscape is constantly changing, the fact that, you know, we need to have really good prioritization and analysis mechanisms in place to be able to address these problems. One common process that we kind of employ with a lot of our customers is sort of what you see on this slide, which is that it begins with, you know, centralizing and consolidating all the information that is relevant. So when we talk about it, we're talking about, you know, bringing in data from your network scanners, your application scanners, your penetration testing results, your database vulnerabilities, essentially any source of assessment or monitoring that you might have within your organization that reports vulnerabilities, right? Because the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that if vulnerabilities are being reported anywhere in our infrastructure, we want to make sure that all of that information is brought in together to one place. The reason why this becomes challenging is because we're using different tools to do all of these things. So your SAST and DAS tools might be reporting vulnerabilities in one format, your network scanners might be reporting vulnerabilities in another format, your database scanners might be reporting vulnerabilities in a completely different format. And these are also tools that are owned by different teams. So really these are silos within your organization. So it becomes really important to bring all of this information together into a single standard consistent format. And once we bring all of this information together, then we must add what we call context to this. So, okay, we have a list of vulnerabilities that exist in our environment, but what do these vulnerabilities mean to us as an organization, right? How are we as an organization impacted by these vulnerabilities? What business processes, what products, what business functions are impacted by these specific vulnerabilities, because they rely on the infrastructure that is impacted by these vulnerabilities to be able to function normally. So we need to bring in all of that context together. We also need to bring in threat intel, which sort of presents the opposite side of the coin in terms of context. So business context is internal context. It's telling us what these vulnerabilities mean to our organization, but threat intel tells us what these vulnerabilities mean to everybody else, right? What do these vulnerabilities mean to hackers and attackers? Are they using a particular vulnerability as part of their attack toolkit? Is it part of a malware? Are we hearing more chatter about a particular vulnerability? So all of this is really context that is important when we're doing our prioritization. So once we bring all of this information together, the business context, the threat intel, every single source of vulnerability that we want to look at, we then prioritize what has the biggest impact to us, what are the most critical vulnerabilities that we need to address. And once we prioritize these vulnerabilities, that is essentially when we create a consolidated list of what we must fix. And once we do that, after that, we need to go and actually do the remediation. So obviously, remediation is a really important part of this process, something that a lot of people struggle with, and it's really important for us to do that effectively as well. And what that means is, making sure that, you're giving the best possible information to the people that are supposed to fix these problems, that you're giving them, let's say, the least amount of work that will fix the most problems. So helping them be more efficient and effective at their job. And then finally, reporting and analytics is a really important part of the process, really throughout the process, because you have different stakeholders, like your asset owners, like your business owners, like your security professionals who are actually doing the fixing and the remediating, and you want to make sure that they are all informed automatically, they're informed at every stage of the process, and again, they're kept into the loop, so they're contributing towards the eventual goal, which is reducing overall security risk in the organization. So that's a good end-to-end process that we see a lot of our customers sort of follow.
Sayed, it seems that, to address vulnerability management effectively, you have to look at many different pieces, right, of relevant data together. And this information, as you know, right, can reside in many different places within an organization. It can vary between organizations. How do organizations ensure a consistent, vulnerability management process in this environment?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that really is the problem that most organizations struggle with. Because if we look at vulnerability management as a problem in itself, it is not a very complicated problem in the sense that if you have, let's say, a very few number of vulnerabilities that are being reported in your environment. Let's say you have a really small environment where just 10 vulnerabilities are being reported. It's kind of easy to determine what to do with those, right? You can fix all of them because it doesn't take too much time. You can even prioritize by doing your own manual research and so on. But when we're talking about millions of vulnerabilities being reported every week or every month, which is pretty standard for a lot of organizations, this problem becomes really complicated because now you are required to look at a lot of these different data points, and not only look at them, you need to make sure that these data points are up to date, that they're presenting the relevant information, that they're being correlated to the information that you need to analyze. And so what we have discovered is the concept of a knowledge graph, which we kind of stumbled upon because we took a decision many years back to change our database backend to Neo4j, which is a graph database. And that's sort of where our vision kind of got aligned with the concept of a knowledge graph as well. So just talking about knowledge graphs, a knowledge graph is a system that acquires and integrates information into an ontology and applies reasoning to derive new knowledge. So, we'll get into this definition in a little bit more detail, but just to think about it, a knowledge graph is essentially a system that is designed to incorporate data and information from a lot of different places. So it has to be fairly robust in its mechanisms to be able to analyze and interpret that data, and it applies certain logics and reasoning to derive new information. Knowledge graphs, whether you're familiar with it or not, they're already a part of your life because they're used by some of the most prominent commercial technologies of our times, including Google, which uses knowledge graphs, which is really where this term and definition originates from. So Google uses knowledge graphs to essentially structure their results. So if you do a Google search, that little card on the right that shows you everything that this thing that you're searching for is related to, it is being generated because Google has built a knowledge graph of terms and things and relationships that they can now apply to present this information. Similarly, Facebook uses knowledge graphs, they call it a social graph, to create the mappings between individuals and their relationships to other people as well as to other things. And similarly, LinkedIn does it applies it in a similar manner. But the common thing about all of these scenarios is that they are designed to process information that is changing over time, where we need to establish relationships and track those relationships as they evolve over time. So just think about it, right? Like on Facebook, initially when Facebook started, it had a specific subset of data that it was capturing for everybody. That data set has grown over time, and they have been able to do that because the underlying technology is a knowledge graph that can essentially evolve as the data sets around it evolve. So kind of applying that to, our problem and kind of talking in more real terms, what does a knowledge graph really do? So the defining characteristics of a knowledge graph are that it connects everything. So it's literally a graph like the data structure where everything is a node and a relationship, and everything essentially can be connected, and you can traverse those relationships as long as those relationships exist. It defines a common language, so essentially it defines a structure in which this information should be processed, so it's not ad hoc, you're defining a structure and ontology for this information. It answers complex questions, so it creates new knowledge based on the analysis that it's doing from this existing knowledge, so it's also generating insights, it's generating knowledge, and very importantly, it evolves as you innovate, so it's alive. With graphs, it's a very simple data structure in the sense that everything is a node and relationship, and everything else about that data is built as context. So if you have new data that is coming in, you can essentially incorporate it into an existing knowledge graph by adding additional context. So kind of going through these points again, what this means to us in our problem as vulnerability management, when we say that it connects everything, it connects all of your vulnerability results, your scanners, the results that are coming up from your CMDB systems, any additional context, it connects your threat intel. So all of that information is in one place for analysis and for prioritization. It defines a common language, so it defines a common language in which you can analyze all of this data that could be coming in from different scanners and different tools. It answers complex questions, so it automatically prioritizes vulnerabilities based on the logic that we have defined in the knowledge graph. And it evolves as you innovate. So again, if you have additional, let's say, scanners that you want to use, or if you want to use additional data points that need to be part of your analysis, it can actually incorporate all of that. So your vulnerability management program, if it's based on a knowledge graph, it essentially evolves as you evolve, and it does all of these things consistently and constantly. One other thing that I do want to talk about really quickly is I mentioned an ontology. So ontology is really the language and structure that we define for our data, right? So this is a sample ontology that we have presented. It varies for different organizations based on what information they have and what they would like to look at. But if you look at this, what this is doing is it's defining the relationships between the entities that we need to monitor. So in this case, it's looking at applications which could be dependent on hosts. It's also looking at databases which could be dependent on hosts and certain relationships between these assets. And then it's connecting these assets to everything that is relevant. So on the left, it's bringing in asset context, which could be things like business context, compliance requirements, configuration management, access management, any information about these assets that is relevant to our analysis. It's connecting all of these assets to that information. On the right, it is providing the structure for how you can bring in different types of vulnerabilities into the same ontology by essentially normalizing all of that data into a few specific structures. In this case, we're using vulnerabilities, findings, and issues, and we're mapping all the different vulnerability types that are coming in from our scanners into these three types. And these could be, your network vulnerabilities, your database vulnerabilities, your static code analysis tests, your dynamic analysis tests, your penetration tests, essentially any types of vulnerabilities that you are concerned about, you can map them into this common format. And then further, it is connecting each of these vulnerabilities to what we call vulnerability intelligence, which includes things like threat intel, it includes things like patch intelligence. So again, providing a common structure and language in which to process all of this information, which is super, super important in a complex data-intensive problem like vulnerability management.
So, yeah, quick question. Given what we discussed so far, what critical capabilities must vulnerability management programs develop, if you will, to address the security control, effectively?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the three things that really stand out to us in terms of capabilities, and these are fairly generic capabilities. In reality, these have to be converted into actual actionable items and tasks, would be knowledge automation and analytics. And what we mean by that is the knowledge to essentially take the right decisions, so making sure that all of the information that is relevant to the analysis process, in this case, things like business context, compliance requirements, threat intel, patch intel, all of this information that is relevant is available in one single place. And it sounds, I don't know if it sounds simple or not, but it is, in reality, it's a very complex problem because we're talking about all of these separate isolated data sets that are continuously evolving by themselves, but then we have to bring all of it together and we have to correlate it to our assets and to our vulnerabilities. So it's not impossible, but it does require a certain degree of understanding what your problem is and what your organization is, and making sure that all of this information that is available is brought in effectively, and it's available when you need it. The second thing that we recommend people really focus on is automation. So again, with this type of data-intensive problems where there are so many different moving parts and so many things that are constantly changing, the more automation that you can inject in your process, the better it is for you, the more consistent you can be with your results. So again, trying to automate as much of the overall process as you can. And then finally, analytics, again, because there are so many different stakeholders that are involved in this process, that you want to make sure that you're doing a good job of keeping everybody engaged and informed, from your business users to asset owners to the actual security professionals. The ability to communicate what the process and program is going through is absolutely critical. So I would say these three things are definitely some of the most important aspects that we recommend people focus on.
Thank you, Sayed. Yeah, those three capabilities, knowledge, automation, analytics, that makes perfect sense. Can we focus on the knowledge aspect just for a second? And correct me if I'm wrong, but a knowledge graph, right, presents an option for how information can be incorporated into the vulnerability management process. Sayed, can you talk a little bit about what information should be incorporated, and how can organizations ensure that all the information that is relevant to their security posture is actually being incorporated? Absolutely.
So yeah, you're absolutely spot on in saying that a knowledge graph is nothing but a tool. It's a system that you can apply to all kinds of problems. So it kind of defines that if you have a really intensive data problem, these are the things that you must do to really be able to generate effectively new knowledge that you can apply to problems. But what becomes equally important is what information are you putting into this knowledge graph. And for us to be, or for any organization to be able to answer that effectively, you have to ask yourself certain questions. And these questions are designed to understand what your priorities are. So these are three questions that a lot of our customers sort of apply when they're deciding what their overall knowledge graph and what data sets they need to bring in. Other organizations could have other priorities for their vulnerability management program. Absolutely. These are just three examples that let you get to a decision in terms of what all different types of assets and tools and information you need to integrate. And we call them critical questions of risk because they really define, they really force you to focus on where the risks that are relevant to you as an organization, where do they lie in your organization, and where are they in your list of priorities. So the first one would be which vulnerabilities, if exploited, pose the greatest risk of disrupting critical business functions. For an organization to be able to answer this question, you have to create a mapping between your technical assets, which are your hosts and applications, and the actual business functions that they're supporting, right? And this question is important to organizations which have, let's say, some really high-value functions that they need to perform. So let's say you're an investment bank or you're a trading firm, and you have a trade floor where all of your business is done, and it is super critical for your functions. You cannot let that go down for even a millisecond because it's going to cost you billions of dollars or whatever. So in that case, what you want to do is you want to make sure that all the technology assets that are supporting this really critical business function, which is the ability to execute trades, you want to make sure that any vulnerabilities that exist on these assets, they automatically move to the top of your list, right? You want to absolutely prioritize and reduce any likelihood or chance that somebody might be able to get access to these systems. So that is sort of one way of looking at it, right? Another question could be which vulnerabilities, if exploited, pose the greatest risk of exposing vital or confidential data. So again, for certain types of organizations, this might actually be more important than the first question. So if you're processing really sensitive information, like healthcare firms and or credit organizations which are tracking people's credit data and PII information, or even things like credit cards, which increasingly everybody processes. So if you're processing some really, really critical information of your customers, and more than anything else, it's important for you to be able to protect that information, then we need to build what we call data context. So essentially an understanding of, where is all of our critical data coming from and where is it going? What are the different systems that have access to it? In that case, your priority might be to really focus and fix and secure those processes or those functions. And then finally, a third question could be which vulnerabilities stand the greatest risk of being exploited. In this case, it's not so much the impact of an exposure that we're concerned about. We're trying to reduce the likelihood that an exposure will happen, right? So in this case, we might be more concerned with making sure that throughout the breadth of our infrastructure, all the easily exploitable problems are the things that we really focus on and that we fix. And by asking these questions and answering these questions, we can kind of get to the main types of data sets that we would want to incorporate. Now, three important categories of these data sets are what we classify. One would be vulnerability intelligence. So this means, all the different types of vulnerabilities that could be reported, your network, web applications, static code, open source, but also any additional information like threat intel, patch intel, any information that is coming in from your SINs about these vulnerabilities. You want to make sure that you have as complete a picture about each critical vulnerability as possible. So vulnerability intelligence would be one type of data set that you could bring into the system. Asset intelligence is, again, another really important component because this is what helps us establish context. So things like your CMDB systems, which have a lot of asset information. Increasingly, we're seeing network configuration management systems, so the tools that manage your network segments, which is one of the first security procedures that we employ on our networks, bringing in that information. IPS systems, again, you could have a vulnerability on a box, but you could have an IPS policy that protects against that vulnerability. So again, that becomes important for us to understand things like business continuity, disaster recovery, web application firewalls, policy compliance. All of these things are good candidates for bringing into the system to improve our asset intelligence. And then finally, remediation intelligence, so things that help us do a better job of prioritizing things as well as fixing things. Directory services, ITSM is a critical component because a lot of the workflows for remediation are managed in these systems, so you want to make sure that you're well integrated. Patch management systems, server automation for things like orchestration, good mechanisms for validation. So again, these are all data sets that have their merits as part of this problem. Which ones you want to include really depends on what your priorities as an organization are.
Sayed, there seem to be a lot of moving parts in this process, right? So you mentioned vulnerability intelligence and all the systems and data sets under that umbrella, asset intelligence, remediation intelligence. Is it possible to automate any parts of this vulnerability management program?
Yes, absolutely. So one, it is possible, and two, it's really essential if you think about it, because again, once we get to a certain scale in terms of the data that we're processing, it's really hard to do these things manually. So we should really try to employ as much automation, inject as much automation in our processes as we can. And we can do this in different parts of the process. So this is, sort of another look at the typical vulnerability management process, which kind of breaks it down into the consolidation, contextualization, prioritization, remediation buckets. We can employ significant automation at each of these steps. So in the consolidate part, we can automate the fact that, our network scanners and application scanners, wherever they're reporting vulnerabilities in whatever formats, we can automate the conversion of that format into a standard format. And that becomes really important because for us to evaluate all of these things consistently, we need for things to be in in a consistent format that can be analyzed uniformly. So we can absolutely automate, both the scanning of these assets as well as the analysis, or the incorporation of these results into our cyber risk management program. Taking it a step further, the contextualization side or step of the process, where we have to build business context and build data context. Again, because this information lives in a lot of different places, so business context information could be, let's say, coming from your CMDB system, it could be coming from your regulatory department, it could be coming from your compliance requirements, it could be coming from a lot of different places. So the action of consolidating all of that information and correlating it, those are definitely things that we can automate and that we should automate, because if we are trying to manually bring this information and associate it to the data that we need to, it makes the problem significantly more difficult. On the prioritization side, again, bringing in threat intel, we can automate a lot of things with that. And the key thing there is that the challenge with threat intel typically is that it presents you with a lot of information. So you have to do a really good job of essentially parsing through and identifying what is relevant to your use case and incorporating just that. So again, that act of identifying, once you identify, the act of bringing that information into your risk analysis process, that's something that we can automate. The analysis, again, is highly recommended to automate that, because anytime any of these variables that go into building a risk score change, you want to make sure that your risk scores are automatically changing as well. Otherwise, you can be in situations where your analysis is no longer up to date, and it ends up hurting you. So we can definitely automate that as well. Once we have prioritized, we need to fix these problems. A lot of times organizations are using ITSM tools to essentially manage these tickets and workflows. So that is, again, something that we can automate. We can automate the creation of tickets. We can automate how tickets are created and how they're structured to be most effective. And then finally, with the ITSM, we're assuming that things are being remediated manually, but the orchestration side, where we can actually automate the fixing of things, and it's a fairly new field right now, and it's still early stages, but we're seeing some really promising integrations and results in the orchestration space as well. So I'm just going to skip over these slides really quickly. I think we're running out of time, and we'll move on to analytics, but I highly encourage anybody to download these slides and go through them after the session. So Holger, do you have any questions around the analytics piece? I know we're almost at the end of our slides, and we'll turn it over to the demo side really quickly. But did you have any questions on this piece? Okay, I'll take that as a no, and I'll cover analytics just really quickly. So
sorry about that. I think I had my finger on the mute button for too long.
No problem.
So thanks for bringing that up, because I think you'd agree, right, that engaging and informing your stakeholders, right, with appropriate information is a critical task, right, for all InfoSec programs. Let me ask you this: what are some of the key, risk and performance metrics that should be tracked and communicated in those programs?
Sure, yeah. So that's absolutely, analytics is a big part of this process, because we need to make sure that all the different stakeholders, and there are a lot of different stakeholders in this process, that we're informing and engaging them effectively. And these are just some types of metrics that we recommend organizations track for their vulnerability management programs. So asset risk is one big category of metrics. When we talk about asset metrics, what we're really saying are things like, what are your most vulnerable hosts? What are your most vulnerable applications? What is your scanner coverage for your network hosts? Or what is your scanner coverage like for your applications? How frequently are you scanning these devices? How up to date is this information? And these are all things that, business owners or asset owners really need to be informed and available. This information needs to be available to them, because it directly impacts the security of their assets. So you want to make sure that any type of asset risk and asset metrics are being reported well. Similarly, on the business side, we want to make sure that business exposure metrics are being reported properly as well. So things like what are the risk levels by a particular asset region, by a particular location, by a particular business unit. Are there certain kinds of problems that are impacting a particular location more than it is others? And we can make some really smart deductions based on those types of metrics. The vulnerability impact metrics obviously are super important. Things like what is the vulnerability risk distribution over your enterprise? What are the top vulnerabilities that are impacting your organization? And then also specific vulnerability tracking. So things like meltdown inspector or anything else that suddenly pops up in the news, and your board suddenly asks you, hey, what are we doing about this vulnerability? It is really important for you to be able to narrow down into these very specific segments of your data and be able to report your performance against them really quickly and really effectively. Similarly, technology impact metrics, so things like what are the main technologies where most of your risk lies? Are there particular vendors that are injecting more risk into your organization, and maybe you should look at replacing them? Which devices are being end-of-lifed? Keeping track of the vulnerabilities associated with end-of-life software or hosts or that might still be in your organization. Remediation performance obviously is super important. So things like ticket closure rates, ticket resolution based on assignments. So how are certain groups or users doing with their tasks? How are we doing resolution versus the SLAs that we have defined? Are we seeing any vulnerability recurrence based on what we're doing? Are we seeing certain vulnerabilities pop up again after being remediated? Things like that make it super important. And then finally, also patch effectiveness. So which of our patches are important that can reduce risk significantly over certain parts of our infrastructure. So doing analysis over the patching results again is super important. Any questions on that, Holger? I think we're running a little low on time, so I'd like to turn it over to James really quickly for our short demo.
All right. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
All right. Is the screen showing up for you? Looks like there we go. All right. So, yeah, I think, what we've been talking about so far today really focuses on a few different pieces of information. The big one that we work with in the Brinker environment is really focusing on centralizing information from many disparate sources in order to normalize that information and provide as much context as we can into our assets or our applications, so we can really start to understand how we should be prioritizing the remediation process. And so what we'll kind of look at through this demo is how that data comes in, how it's represented to the user, some of the pieces of automation, and then some different views or reports that we can represent to the user as well. So what we're looking at here, just real briefly, is the home dashboard of the application. This is kind of the first piece of flexibility within the Brinker environment that the user will interact with. Every dashboard can be configured to show different metrics based on things like a user's role or location. So we can show higher level metrics that show group comparisons or location risk to executives or director level. But when a risk analyst logs in, they're going to be more interested in the technical information. So we can also start to show things like the vulnerability distribution by software or particular types of vulnerabilities or issues, such as what we see here on the left-hand side. Now, I want to take just a brief moment and look at how data actually comes in or just kind of speak to that process. So if I go to the administration page and I look at some of our available data connectors, really, as we said, this information is stored in multiple locations. Sometimes it's a CMDB, sometimes it comes from the scanner itself. A lot of organizations have, on-prem databases or directories. And so being able to have a wide variety of connectors to talk to all of these different sources is critical in actually using that information effectively. And so what we see here, this is just kind of a small sample of what Brinker offers, but it does show, the different types of categories that Brinker commonly works with. So looking at things like application security scanners or any of our compliance or configuration management, on-prem sources like we discussed, ticket integration, as Said was talking about some of the automation in the remediation process. You know, once we can actually automate ticket creation and have a very consistent process for how we capture those vulnerabilities, then we can actually send those out to the existing ITSMs to, you know, not interfere with the workflow there, but actually more effectively work with it. Other tools like network management to start to understand asset relationships. So we may have, you know, business critical assets on a network that are surrounded by vulnerable servers that may not be business critical themselves, but we can increase the prioritization due to network relationships. And then also looking at more of like the real-time threat understanding, so threat intelligence feeds or exploits or malware contexts, and then also vulnerability management scanners. We also talked about, you know, the flexibility of bringing this data in and touched on the graph database. So we do go through a very simple mapping process. It really just outlines what information is coming in from the source and where do we want that to go on the Brinker data model side. And so once we go through that process, you know, we can automate the syncs, pull in information, and really this is all around, you know, offloading resources of users and just making sure that the Brinker environment always has the most up-to-date information that's, you know, easily accessible and ready to use for any of the end users. Now, if we start to take a look at some of the data that I have here in the system, we'll start out and take a look at some of the vulnerabilities. We can see that in this list of vulnerabilities, we do have, you know, some of the common tracking attributes, so things like status, which we can automate the tracking of. We can identify new, active, fixed, or reopened, regardless of the scanner source. So we can use things like intelligence to determine if a newer scan was performed and a vulnerability no longer showed up on that asset. Then we can change it to resolved or fixed, and if it comes back later on, we can update that same record to reopen. So we really do have accurate tracking on even the individual vulnerability layer. And then also looking at things like the risk score. So the Brinker risk score, you know, we'll take a look in just a second at some of the host information that can be brought in. But in context of prioritization, looking at things like business services or environments, understanding whether a host is test or development or production, looking at, you know, if servers or databases are storing or processing personal information or have to follow HIPAA regulations, we can take all of this into account when using our open risk score calculation and actually calculate a risk score that resembles the risk and prioritization factors of your specific organization rather than the details of just the vulnerability itself. And so looking at, you know, different ways to work with this data, we do have searching and filtering supported as well. So if we jump up, we take a look at vulnerabilities now, we'll look at the host view. Hosts are very similarly built out to all the other data models. In this case, we're showing a bit more of the ownership and relationship structures of a particular host within the system. So we can see things like owners and the directors that a host rolls up to, the service team that's responsible for remediation efforts, which we'll take a look at when we get to things like tickets, because we can use this property to make sure that vulnerabilities are automatically being assigned to the appropriate remediation team. And then if we actually take a look at, you know, one of the hosts that we have within the environment, we get even more detail about that host. We can very quickly see the asset details, tracking, you know, things like the device type or the operating system. Next, we have some of the business criticality context, so looking at whether the criticality itself of the asset is increased for the organization, if there's any compliance criteria as we discussed, and then also looking at the various relationships, so whether there's relationships to applications that the host supports, any business services or network segments, and then the ownership relationships as well. Below that, on the host level, we can start to see the different types of relationships from the lower level that we can create as well. So in this case, we have vulnerabilities directly related to an asset or server. So that our first table represents a list of all of those vulnerabilities reflected on that host. And then below that, we have other various items as well. So in this case, we have policy violation scans that are being run, and we can tie those into the same host as well. And we can take both of these models and use that to contribute to really an overall host risk score. So how much risk does this single asset represent to the organization based off of all of the different risk items associated to it, so vulnerabilities and violations in this case. Now, if we jump up to another layer and kind of see the bigger picture of really how all the different objects can come together, in this case, I'll take us over to the application side, and we'll start to look at things and relationships like infrastructure to support an application. Below that, I can have components that can have their own risk factor. I can have my static code analysis issues, dynamic analysis findings, or even any manual pen test information. And again, just like we saw in host, all of these different pieces of information can tie into different sections of an app score. So we can have our software risk component, our infrastructure risk component, and together those can give us an overall risk score for the application as a whole. Let's see. So let's take a look at, I guess, some of what the automation can do. We looked at vulnerabilities themselves, and we talked briefly about how we can use things on the host layer to make sure that we assign tickets correctly. So if we take a look at some of the tickets that I have within the environment, what we'll see is that these tickets were created within Brinker. We can actually have various assignment structures, so we can have an assigned to field that's coming automatically from the ticket creation rule. And we can also do consolidated tickets, so we could have a number of hosts or vulnerabilities presented onto a single ticket. And so if we take a look at how some of that automation runs within the tool, we'll look at just real briefly a Windows vulnerability ticket creation rule. And what we can see here is that, again, we're just using some of those same properties. We have a little bit of flexibility in how we can capture that, and it's pretty easy to work with. So in this case, we're capturing tickets on the vulnerability model. We can automatically trigger when tickets run, so yet further automation and making sure that we have an efficient ticket creation process and that they're being captured as soon as they're brought in. In this case, we would probably do something like after sync and calculation. So we let all the information come in, allow the risk score to calculate, and then we would go ahead and run through our conditions and create the tickets. So in this case, our ticket creation rule is looking for high vulnerabilities on Windows OS. And so I can use those conditions to actually filter down to that group of vulnerabilities. And then same thing for ticket properties. I have a lot of flexibility there. So we talked about the ticket assignment. This is where we do our dynamic ticket assignment. And in this case, we're just referencing an attribute. And then for vulnerabilities, we're going to look at the vulnerabilities host service team for ownership. And then we can also do things like set SLAs. So all of this happens automatically as soon as vulnerabilities are brought into the environment. And then pushed out to the existing ITSM, so allowing for increased efficiency and consistency within the process as well. The last thing that we'll take a look at here just for a few minutes are some of the reports that we can create within the environment. So now that we have all of this data around the vulnerability scanning process, identifying the entire life cycle of a vulnerability or application issue, all of the host information or prioritization information, we can start to use all of this data to create very specific metrics to really configure reports to show specific sets of information that might be used for particular action items. So in this case, we're looking at a report shown for vulnerability management program. We can see things like how many assets we have within the system, maybe a subgroup of those, like how many legacy systems. If we have scan windows defined on how frequently we need to scan our assets, we can set up containers to reflect those metrics. And then in this case, looking at distribution by location. So each location has a number of assets and certain bucketed windows. In this case, we can see how many servers have been scanned in 90 days or within the last year for every location within our system. Other reports can be used to show ownership structure and look at the remediation process. So here we can see all of the vulnerability distribution by each individual owner within the environment. And we can actually dynamically change all of our reports as well. So once we do configure a report to have the certain gauges and metrics and bars and graphs that we want to show, we can also provide inputs. And if we had a particular director that we wanted to show, we can see the entire report will update to the information that's only relevant to that user. We can do the same thing for groups or other relationships. And then here's the last report kind of looking at more of the application structure. We can see things like the underlying infrastructure risk. our static code distribution, dynamic code distribution, so really all of the components that represent risks to an application. And then same thing, we have inputs where we can select an application from the dropdown, and all of the metrics update to really just give us the risk for that one particular application. All right, I'll hand it back over to Kayla, and I think we have a few minutes left for questions.
James, thanks for handing it back over. Yeah, I think we have a couple minutes left before we'll go ahead and close out today. So we'll try and get through a few questions. One of the questions I got was, can you talk about what threat intel factors can be incorporated for risk prioritization?
Yeah, sure. So I can take that. With threat intel, we're looking at a few different things typically, things like, do exploits exist for a particular vulnerability? Are there any known indicators, such as, known malwares or toolkits? Those are things that we're able to incorporate. Some of it does depend on, what particular flavor of threat intel you have in place. From our perspective, it's a single way of incorporating data and building it into the risk process. But those are some of the common factors that we see folks incorporate. So things like, we have also seen some more interesting attributes like, the popularity of a particular vulnerability or a CVE, which a lot of threat intel providers determine by looking at things like the hacker chatter in the dark web. So, if there are more mentions of a particular vulnerability on forums where we know malicious actors to converse or talk about, they can kind of determine that, there is more renewed focus on this particular vulnerability. So it's possible that it might be weaponized. But just in general, a lot of good information coming in from threat intel, specifically about how different vulnerabilities are being weaponized. Are they being incorporated as part of toolkits or malwares? Are they part of any known attacks that are happening elsewhere in the world, which means that they could be turned against you as well? So yeah, a lot of exploit information, a lot of vulnerability weaponization information that we can sort of build into the risk models.
Awesome, thanks. So here's another one. James, I think this might be best for you to take. Can you create reports about remediation timing and efficiency?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So a lot of what we can do with our reports is, we didn't really have time to look into it, but we do have a report UI editor. It's a graphical interface that allows us to modify reports, and what we can actually do there is use any of the existing data models or attributes to report on those as metrics. And so we can pull them in and create, different dimensions to look at those values. But we very much can create reports focused more on the remediation side and look at things like due dates or how many vulnerabilities are past due and their various distributions.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more quick question. So the question is, our asset information lives in a lot of different places. How can we utilize it for business context?
So yeah, I think, both of us can maybe address this. I think from my perspective, that is a fairly common scenario. It's not just you. For most organizations, asset information lives in a lot of places because there really isn't a single, central repository of all asset information. CMDB is kind of played the de facto role, but that's more for internal IT. It might not have as much of the business context as we would like. So in that scenario, we are really aggregating business context from a lot of different places. Various times people are doing things like business continuity and disaster recovery efforts and assessments, the BIA analysis, where they are identifying, how critical a particular asset or application is. So it's fairly common that the information that you might want to build into your risk scoring lives in a lot of places. Bringing it together and correlating is definitely something that is important. It's a point of focus for us, and at least on our side, we've made a lot of effort to make that really high performance and really easy to use.
Thank you for the response to that. So we're actually coming up right on the end of our webinar time. So I just want to thank you all for attending our session today on modern vulnerability management. If you hopped on late today or missed anything in the deck or want to get a copy of it, please feel free to reach out to us. On-demand version of this webinar will be up shortly, so if you want to go back and re-listen to any parts of this, or also feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions we didn't get to today. And also just a big thanks to Holger for joining us today. I think he added a lot of really valuable insight and had a lot of really great questions. Everyone have a great rest of your week, and we hope you enjoy the long weekend.
Thanks, everyone.